We're really so grateful, Elizabeth, that you could be with us tonight. It's such a treat. I've just started working with Elizabeth recently on a couple different projects, and it's been really just a highlight for me. Elizabeth is a professor in biological sciences at SFU, and she's devoted her career really to studying pollinators and pollination, and but also really to education. And Elizabeth has been an administrator at SFU for a long time, and it's been really obvious for all of us who work with her is how much she puts students forward and education forward. And really, it's kind of neat because she's also a passionate gardener, and this whole bee project and how she's spending the last part of her career is bringing together gardening and education and outreach, and of course, interest in pollination. We're so lucky to get her because we just kind of slid in. She already has like 12 presentations from here now till April when she does field work, and she's already booked like well into 2027. So thank you so much, Elizabeth, for doing this. Lastly, just a few housekeeping items. It'd be great if you guys could keep your microphones off until the end when we take questions. And we'll take questions either by you guys raising your hand with what's that tool called?
Yeah.
There's a tool at the bottom that you can raise your hands, and or just to write it in the chat. But we'll be administrating all that later on. So you guys all saw this is going to be recorded. There will be a recording available on the link site later for viewing, and or reviewing, if some of you have come and wanted to just to make sure that you got all the wonderful details. So I think that's from me, all from me. If you guys wanted, just all of you to turn on your videos just for a split second, you're welcome to do that, just so Elizabeth can see your lovely faces. And I also, if you want to, you can write in the chat where you're calling in from, however you defined the territory that you're currently sitting in. So yeah, just to wave to Elizabeth, just to know she's not a bunch of empty black boxes. So lovely. Okay, Elizabeth, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. This has been so much fun working with Dana and Ken. And seeing Gavia's face is pretty special. I haven't seen you, Gavia, since you were an undergraduate, so that's pretty awesome. Um, as Dana said, yes, my passion these days is mostly on knowledge translation and working with the public about the organisms that I think are worth saving, and that's bees and other pollinators. I need to say before I say anything else and before I share my screen, I need to share that I am very grateful to live and work on the traditional and unceded lands of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam peoples. I'm grateful to the Métis Nation for their stewardship of these lands. And whenever I give a land acknowledgement, for me, it is, I get kind of emotional because we need to remember that these people were the first gardeners on these lands. Clam gardens, camas gardens, root gardens, forest gardens. There's this myth that it was, just about gathering, but no, they were gardening and they were working these lands just as those of us in this room that are gardeners are working the lands. And I'm very grateful for all of what they've done on these lands. I'm going to share my slides now. I am going to talk about all pollinators, not just bumblebees today, and just try to introduce you to some of the amazing diversity of pollinators that we have in BC. I'm going to start with why they matter. The vast majority of flowering plants require an animal to reproduce. They cannot reproduce without help, without an animal to move pollen from one flower to the other, which results in seed and fruit production. We don't say that about animals, right? But it's true for plants. We know that when we go looking, the vast majority of studies indicate that plant reproduction is limited by pollen delivery. So basically, they're not getting enough. And we also know that here in BC, so many of our birds and mammals, the charismatic organisms that people care about often more than insects that can sting you, have pollinator-dependent fruits and seeds as an important part of their diet. They're important not just for that wildlife, but of course also for us. So I like to remind people that 1 out of 3 bites you eat is thanks to a bee, and it's not just because of a honeybee. So the honeybee on this slide is in the upper left. on an apple blossom. But all of the other insects on this slide are not honeybees. It's the bees that are native to a place that do most of the work in our food production. And sometimes it's not a bee at all. So one of the major food groups for me is chocolate, and that is a midge. It's about the size of a mosquito. That is the pollinator responsible for chocolate production. Here in British Columbia, we anything that visits a flower can be a pollinator, but in the research that I've done with my students, it's mostly about the bees. 70 to 95% of the visits that we document are done by bees, and that's because bees are actively collecting pollen and nectar to provision their nest, to bring it back to the nest and feed their young. Of course, that's just the female bees. We'll get to that. The bottom thing, and I'm going to move this now, so you can see them. All those things on the bottom are not bees. They also can be important pollinators, those flies and wasps and birds and butterflies, but they do a lot less of the work because their offspring are not being fed the pollen and nectar that a bee would be collecting from a flower. There are 20,000 species of bee on the planet, 800 in Canada, 500 in BC, and at the coast, which is where Lasqueti is, it's about 200 species of bees. And we know that these bees are declining. So what these graphs are showing is declines in native species, which is the top two graphs, and increases in introduced species. These data are from the United States. We don't have comparable data for Canada, but we're seeing big changes in the communities of pollinators. We know some of our pollinators are at risk of extinction. And given their importance for natural ecosystems as well as our own food, I think caring about pollinators is an obvious thing to do. Um, and the main reason that pollinators and really all plants and animals are at risk of extinction is habitat loss. And so humans have converted about 75% of the terrestrial land mass for our own use. We've altered it. And about half of the land mass has been converted specifically for agriculture. And so this is a photograph of blueberry and cranberry fields out in Pitt Meadows, places I've worked quite a lot, where they're having a pollination problem because those areas are basically a food desert and the bees can't survive in them. Obviously, food for humans is an important thing, but this kind of habitat conversion is a real challenge for many kinds of organisms. And the nice thing about bees, as opposed to something like polar bears, is that we all can do something to support them. All animals need food and lodging. That's what habitat is. And gardens can be really important in compensating for habitat loss. And of course, this depends on your context. I know that there's still a lot of forest on Lasqueti and in other places where that natural environment will still exist. But where we have conversion of land for other uses, gardens can help to fill the gap. This is my front yard. There was this gorgeous old Douglas fir. It's probably we estimate 250 years old based on its diameter. And when we moved in, it had English ivy and that pampas grass growing on it, and that was it. The picture on the right is how it looked about 5 years after we moved in, and now it's a bit closer to this. We keep adding more things. There's a mix here of native plants and well-behaved garden plants. And I will tell you that after years of working this land, I now have specialist bees that will use my garden as their home, places where they can find both food and places to nest. You can too. And so what I'm going to do is talk about what all of our pollinators are in BC. I'm going to try to get you excited about bugs. And then I'll talk a little bit about what you can do in the land that you can influence to support beneficial insects, mostly pollinators, but also there's other organisms that I hope you will support in your backyards. And I will say a little bit specific to the kinds of plants that you might consider that are extra good for supporting pollinators. Okay, so and this I want to start with the honeybee because this is not the bee that we should be caring about. The honeybees are incredibly important in agriculture, and the farmers I was working with obviously needed the honeybees to help them produce their crops. And that's because of the natural history of honeybees. You know, they live tens of thousands of them in a hive with a queen and so many workers, and you can bring them where you need them for pollination, like this apple orchard. That's the photo on the right. But they're not native to these lands, and they have been documented to compete with our native bees. In some cases, they've been linked to declines of wild bees because they're so good at getting resources. So one of the things that happened when people started becoming aware that pollinators were declining was people started keeping honeybees because they wanted to save the bees. Keep honeybees if you want the honey, just like you would keep chickens for the eggs, but it's not going to save the bees. These bees are doing just fine. Even when they have some losses over the winter, they're still now all over the globe when they really just arose in Northern Africa and Europe. So it's not about the honeybee, but
She asked
a
to do
lot
that.
of the things that you know about bees, like depending on how advanced you are in your bee knowledge, but a lot of people, the things they know about bees is how they look, and that's based on honeybees. They're these amber and black striped things that put pollen on their legs with a queen and workers, and I want to blow that up for you just a little bit because I think that's fun to do. And I'm going to start with how they look. So in the next
Elizabeth,
series of slides, if I took a photo, it won't have attribution on it, but if it has attribution, it's because someone did a better job than I did. So in this photo, we've got a honeybee and we have a wasp. So in the next few slides, it's going to be arranged just like this. The bee is going to be on the right, and the not a bee is going to be on the left. Okay, so wild bees can look nothing like you think, nothing like a honeybee. So they can look like wasps. That's a cuckoo bee, that beautiful red bee. That's also a cuckoo bee. Mason bees come in more flavors than the ones that you're putting out bee condos for if you do that. This is a green mason bee. I've paired it with a wasp, but they also look a bit like blowflies. There's also the blue orchard bee, which is the one that people put out bee condos for. They look a lot like blowflies to some people. So I usually, when I'm giving talks in person, I bring some pinned insects, and people are surprised because they didn't realize that that's what they were putting the condos out for. And of course, flies and bees and wasps and all those things can look similar. The yellow and black thing is warning coloration. It's basically saying, watch out, I can sting you. And that's true of the bee on the right, but not of the two flies on the left. They don't have the equipment. They're not stinging anybody. Um, some flies are really good bee mimics, and if you see them just from the back end, you might be fooled. I'm going to tell you how to tell flies from bees, but this drone fly has been introduced around the planet, and it is a mimic of honeybees. There are flies that mimic bumblebees, and in fact, their coloration tends to match the bumblebees that they're co-located with. So this bulb fly tends to be red in our area because we have a red-tailed bumblebee. There's also a robber fly that looks, if it's moving quickly, a bit like a bumblebee because it's really fuzzy and it's yellow and red. There's a moth, which when it's in a photo, you're like, that doesn't look like a bee, Elizabeth. But I will tell you that actually, when you see them flying, you sometimes can be fooled. The snowberry clearwing moth uses snowberries and honeysuckle as its host plant, and is actually, I think, a pretty good bee mimic. For the first time, I'm showing you pictures of things that don't occur in British Columbia, just to point out that bees can look really unexpected. The blue bees are some of them. The ones on the right are well, top right and center top are from the tropics, and the other three are from Australia, where yes, the bees come in blue and polka dots. Now, we don't have anything quite that outrageous here, but we do have some quite beautiful colors. One of my favorite mason bees is Osmia bella, the beautiful mason bee that comes in turquoise, like shown here, but also in purple. And there's lots of variation in size. So my friend Steve Buchman took this photo. It's posed, obviously. It's the largest and the smallest bee that we have in North America. So that the big face is a carpenter bee. They don't get this far north, but if you have friends and relations in places like Ontario and Quebec, they have carpenter bees there, and they're also found in California. The largest bee, it's about the size of your thumb. And the smallest bee is Perdita minima. great name, which is only 2 or 3 millimeters long. We do have Perdita, not this species, but others that are just as tiny here in British Columbia. How do you know it's a bee when there's so much variation? Well, they are always vegetarians. They eat pollen and nectar, uh, and 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 that's all. Um, it might get awkward if you see a bee or see an insect and you're wondering to ask, so, what are your food preferences? And if you don't feel comfortable asking that, there's other ways to tell. Um, the thing is that bees will always have 4 wings. They have long antennae. Flies have only two, and their antennae are very short, and they have big bug eyes. I'll show you some pictures. And they're usually fuzzy. And wasps tend to be less fuzzy, and their hair tends to be more silver. But I just showed you so many photos of things that break these rules. I showed you those red bees, for example, and the yellow bees that are pretty hairless. So what's the best way to recognize a bee? I honestly do teach this to my graduate students. They're cute. This is where I wish I could hear you laughing because I know this is a moment for many of you. They really truly are cute because look at those pictures and compare them to the ones I've just put on the screen. So on the lower left are wasps. I think we all know yellow jackets, which is the one on the left. I don't know about you, but I think that the wasps just look meaner. They tend to have their antennae pretty low on their face. It gives them that low criminal forest and forehead kind of thing. And they're just not as cute. The one on the lower left and this one in the middle with this little round cute face, I'm sorry, I think that can be shown by science. And then here's the flies. They have their big bug eyes, their short antennae. They're just not as cute as this boy in the middle with his cute fuzzy little face. And I will explain why I know he's a boy. Um, but they're just cute. So you need to see their face, which is hard if their face is in a flower. The other thing to look for is pollen. So, as I said earlier, bees are going to collect pollen and nectar to provision a nest. Only the females do that. And I'll circle all the pollen carrying devices. So, honeybees and bumblebees put the pollen in a ball on their leg. And I purposely went looking for this photo of the honeybee on a scylla because I want to remind you that pollen isn't always yellow. It can be blue or red or purple or pink. It's all sorts of colors. So they do put their pollen in a ball on their leg. Other kinds of bees put the pollen on the whole leg or under their abdomen. But if you see visible pollen that's obviously not just randomly there because they brushed up against something, it's going to be a female bee. And it's a female bee, not a male bee. I always let a man say this next part. Dave Goulson once wrote, male bumblebees are lazy. You can see gangs of them sitting around on flowers in July and August, and in between drinking, they go looking for mates. Male bumblebees don't do any of the work, and that's true of all species. They really just have one purpose. And as such, if it's a social bee like a bumblebee, they're not welcome in the colony. They're not allowed to be in the nest. They're kicked out and they're off on their own because they're not helping. Most bees are single moms. And so what this means is the cutest thing about male bees, and that's that they sleep in flowers. So if around dusk in the summertime you see bees coming in and landing on a flower, um, it's because they want a nice, cozy place to sleep with their bro friends, cuddling together for warmth. It's absolutely adorable. How can you tell a male bee from a female bee? They usually have mustaches. You can't make this stuff up. I think the reason I find this so adorable is because I wasn't originally trained as an entomologist, but as a plant ecologist. I've got pairs here. So on the top, I've got a bumblebee, male and female, a mason bee, male and female. And the males on the outside to the left are a mining bee and what's the common name of those guys? It's an anthophorid. I can't remember the common name in this moment. And then we have females over on the right. So the male bees have that fuzz on their faces, and if they don't, they often have a yellow plate. And this is very handy if you can notice that because they also can't sting you. They don't have the equipment, only females do. And so if you see a bee with a very fuzzy face and no pollen on its legs, it might be one that you could gently put out your finger and pick it up and give it a pet to see how soft they are. Please be gentle if you do that. And don't blame me if you got it wrong and it's a girl. To tell them apart, you should look at where their pollen is. And this is going to wind up being important for some of the natural history I'm going to tell you. So, bumblebees put their pollen in a ball on their leg, just like a honeybee does. And then we have what we are colloquially these days calling hairy belly bees, where the pollen is under the abdomen. There's special hairs there. Mason bees do this. And then there's mining bees that have pollen pants. There's sweat bees do this too. The pollen is all the way up the leg to the waist. The whole leg is covered in pollen. And once you can notice where the pollen is, once you get that observational trick down, it's going to tell you a lot about where these insects need to live. And that's why I try to get people to notice where the pollen is on the female bees. So let's talk about that. Where do the bees nest? I said the important thing to support bees is food and lodging. The food is the flowers. The lodging is where they're going to make their nests. Most of our bees are solitary. That means a single female initiates a nest, provisions it all on her own, and with no help, right? So she's living alone. And and where she's going to forage is going to be proportional to her body size. So, like a bird, they have a nest and they forage kind of in a circle around that nest. And some of our tiny bees, like that tiny little perdita that I showed you, the really 2 to 3 millimeter bee, they are going to spend their whole life in your backyard. They're going to make a nest there and they're going to forage maybe 50 meters from that nest, not very far. A bumblebee might go as much as 2 kilometers. And so thinking about nests in the land that you can impact, whether it's in your backyard or in a community garden, I think is an important thing to do. Most of our diversity is active in spring here at the coast, and they'll nest either on the ground and in stems, and I'll have more pictures of that in a moment. But first, I want to go through this life cycle on the right. So if we start at the 9 o'clock point, these bees will emerge and mate mostly in the spring. Some will come out later in summer. And when I say spring, I mean by late March, you're likely to start seeing them. Sometimes earlier if it's really warm, like it's been. Each species is only active for 4 to 6 weeks. They don't live very long. And then the adults will die, all the males, all the females, and the larvae will be developing in that nest. They'll overwinter, usually in that nest, and then emerge the next year at the same time. So a bee that is normally active at the end of March, it will provision a nest, it will lay its eggs, and those eggs will stay in the nest all the way until next March. They have used most of our species, not all, but most have only one generation a year. Okay. So how are they doing that? So I mentioned that some of our species nest in the ground, and that includes our mining bees and our sweat bees, and these are all the ones with the pollen pants, with the pollen all the way up their leg to their waist. And while there are some really bright, beautiful ones, like the green metallic sweat bee, most of these are not very exciting in their coloration. They're black or brown, sometimes with stripes. And they vary in size. You can see the range of sizes. That's my finger. And no, she didn't sting me. And in the lower left is a photo on Bacopa, the hanging basket plant. You might know it. So that bee is only about 3 millimeters long. And this is what the nests can look like. So this is a nest I found in Parksville. And you see these little piles of soil. And sometimes people think those are ants, but they're not ants, they're bees. And again, they'd only be active in this way for about a month. There's a little bee balm that you can see when you go looking. Or if you're lucky, this is not far from where I live. Um, you'll see the activity. So there's lots of little piles of soil, and you can see the bees flying around close to the soil surface. They're looking for their nest among all of those nests, if they're females. If they're males, they're looking for females to mate with. And there's also cuckoo bees that lay their eggs in the nests of other bees that would be flying around. So I'm just going to hit go again. Where they like to nest is in places like this. So this is in a park that's really trampled, and so the ground is very firm, and the grass has been killed by all the people walking on it. So if you are someone that has a pretty crummy looking lawn, you might be lucky. Maybe you'll get some mining bees. They like well-drained south or west facing slopes as their favorite place to nest. Okay, go. Oh. No, I've never excavated a nest, but I like to share these photos from people who have. There's a ruler there, and it goes up to I think about 5 inches and 12 centimeters to give you an idea of how deep these little bees have to dig their nest. That bee is only about a half an inch or a centimeter in size, and she digs down into that nest and she provisions it with a ball of pollen. So that will take sometimes 30 to 50 foraging. It depends, foraging trips, depends on what kind of resources she's got. You can see that the cross section of the nest looks kind of shiny, so she waterproofs it with some an exudate from her jaws, basically. It's because remember it has to last through the winter to next year. And then, well, lays a little egg. She does that about 12 times, maybe as many as 20 times, and then she dies, I say, of exhaustion. Just think of all that digging that she has to do. We also have cavity nesters. These are the hairy belly bees, right? So this is why the pollen pants bees are in the ground and the hairy belly bees nest in cavities. And these can be in boxes if you choose to give your bees a bee condo. If you do, please make sure you maintain it because you're now kind of almost keeping them as livestock. So you can have parasites build up in those things. Um, they will also nest in twigs, or a few of them will nest underground. But the thing to notice in this slide is the pollen under the abdomen of the bee. So the center picture on a geranium, you can see all the pollen that leafcutter bee has collected. Some of the mason bees, especially in this group, can be quite brightly colored. The leafcutter bees tend not to be. So this is what a mason bee nest looks like. So if you're familiar with the condos, you've seen things like the upper right, and there's a plug of mud in there. If I was to take that nest and turn it at a right angle so that it's parallel to the screen, that's the photo on the upper right. And so the reason mason bees are called that is because they collect mud to build the walls between the cells of their larvae. So they build a wall of mud, they fill it up with pollen, they lay an egg, they build another wall of mud. And so this photo, it's of a mason bee that doesn't live here, has she has mud in her jaws, and that's why they have those big teeth on their jaws. In fact, the family name is Megachilidae for big teeth. Mason bees have the big teeth for mud collection, but there's other things. So the leafcutter bees use those crazy big jaws to cut pieces of leaf to line their nests. And the top picture is a bee that nested under flagstones in my garden. So our leafcutter bees here in BC are fairly adaptable. They will sometimes nest in the ground as opposed to in above ground in a tube. And if you see the kind of damage, this is an epimedium plant. If you see that, it's not caterpillars, it's not something that's going to kill your plant. You're lucky. It means you have leafcutter bees nesting in your garden. There's also introduced bees in this family that you might come across. I'm wondering if they're over on the island. I'd be curious. I know it's not the focus of the project, but I'm very curious if they're there. Carder bees are named for, any of you are knitters, you know about carding wool, right? Where you take the fibers and I mean, I've never done it, but you comb them out and to make your yarn and your thread. So this bee on the right is collecting those plant hairs with its jaws. It's mowing them off and putting them in a ball. We'll bring them back to line the nest. And on the plant in the center, there you can see the places where those they have been mown down. The carder bees can defend territories. They can chase off other bees. It's entertaining, but not good for those other bees. So I'm not encouraging you to plant hairy plants for them, but if you come across them, they're quite fun to watch. They're good entertainment. One thing I like to remember to say, and so I use this photo that Marguerite Doctorow took years ago, is that all these different kinds of cavity nesters are totally happy to share. They're all solitary. They all are looking for nest sites. They're happy to use a nest box if you put one out for them. And I mentioned leafcutters and masons. There's also some that use resins to delineate their nests. And they come in all sizes. And so most of these commercially available nests have a particular size of hole. And that's for the blue orchard mason bee, but there's so many other mason bees and other cavity nesters. These are varieties, little tiny hairy belly bees. So the holes on the left are the size that are in most of the bee boxes, but if you have smaller holes, you'll get different kinds. It's not that the those little bees can't fit in the big holes. It's just that it's a lot of work to fill that up with their nesting materials. So if you get interested in making a bee condo, there's plans online that for making them with a router that with different sizes, and you'll support more biodiversity that way. And then there's bumblebees, which I know is the main interest of the project that's going to be launched this summer. Bumblebees are different because they're social. We have some semi-social bees in those other groups that I'm just kind of glossing over to give you a feeling for everything. Bumblebees do have a queen and a colony, and the colony can get to 100 or 200 bees, nothing like the 10,000 bees in a honeybee colony. They like to nest in cavities, so these can be abandoned mouse holes, abandoned bird nest boxes. So I'll just put a circle around the bumblebee that's going into the chickadee nest box at my friend's house in West Vancouver. Um, in I have a shed that has insulation in the walls and it has a little gap, and they go in there to nest. They'll use like an air pocket in your compost pile. They need an existing cavity. Unlike those mining bees, they don't dig their own nests. So if we look at the life cycle, the queens, if we start in kind of the 10 o'clock position, the queens will initiate their nest in the springtime. I know somebody who's already seen a queen bumblebee. She's probably not going to be successful because it's not going to stay warm, but it's been so warm. Anyway, I was a little worried about her, but as soon as it starts getting 10 to 15 degrees on a more regular basis, we'll see our queens come out and they'll start a nest. These queens were mated last fall, and they'll start their nest. They'll produce some workers on their own. The first workers tend to be tiny for that reason because she's feeding them all by herself. Eventually, she stops leaving the nest, and in late summer, she'll make males and new queens. So the reproductors for the next year, and those mate, and then everybody dies. All the old workers, the old queen, and the mated queen will overwinter underground, usually in a just a shallow space under the ground, and she'll emerge once it's warm in the springtime. Another reason not to be digging in your garden from November onward, as if the water wasn't enough. Oh, I forgot I had this in here. This is the bee nesting in my shed. That tiny little gap. And I've had two colonies in there, a colony each of the last 2 years. The first year it was this one, the yellow fronted bee, Bombus vossensenskia. The second year it was Bombus melanopygus, the red-tailed bee. And I think it's wonderful. I think somebody else might be less excited. How do you tell a queen from a worker? Well, really, the only difference is how big they are. Queens are fed a lot because they've got the next generation. It's up to them. So the bee on the bottom is a queen. The one on the top is a worker that was still working in the fall, well, late summer when these bees were first, the queen bees were first emerging. Okay, and another quick video. Of course, bumblebees will also use natural areas to nest, so they would find a hollow log, for example. This was a dead tree that was hollow. It was probably to be honest, an old bird nest, but I don't know what would have created that nest, honestly. And the tree eventually fell down because it was so rotten. So I was sent this video because the person was wondering what else they should do, and I said they'll be fine. They're going to be super happy just existing in there and finishing their life cycle. Um, they're super important pollinators. If you grow food, you want bumblebees, and that's because there's quite a few things that we like to eat that are what's called buzz pollinated. So tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, and even blueberries. The pollen has to be vibrated out of the anthers and then collected by the bee to be bringing back to the nest. And bumblebees have that behavior, and other bees, including honeybees, don't. And so they're really important for food production, but they're also, since they're active early spring to fall, they're going to be present in natural areas and in gardens all year round, doing that really important work. And so one of the things I like to tell gardeners is if you want a really good tomato crop, plant something that flowers really early to attract those queen bees to nest in your garden. They can't plan, they can't know that you're going to have tomatoes later. If you have something like heather, or even better, one of our natives like Mahonia, Oregon grape, or Ribes sanguineum, the red flowering currant that bloom early in your garden, then the bumblebees are going to be more likely to make their home with you. And just a reminder, I'm not going to give you too much detail on them, but I want to remind you that anything that visits a flower can be a pollinator. I just completed a study in gardens here in Metro Vancouver, and wasps wound up being a big chunk of the visitors as well as flies. Butterflies actually don't visit very often, and so all the other things wind up doing more. And I like to remind people that these are really good beneficial insects. Wasps, flies, birds are all important for pest control. The larvae of the hoverflies are just aphid eating machines. It's really important. And I think we forget sometimes that hummingbirds feed insects to their offspring. The nectar is just to fuel their own activity. Okay. So, with that brief introduction to all the critters that you might be getting in your garden, I'm going to talk a little bit about more specifically about actions you can take to support all beneficials. And I want to go back to what I said earlier. All animals need habitat. They need food and they need lodging. And so, making the spaces that you can influence, again, whether it's your own property or a local park or a community garden, making them have the food and lodging that these organisms need is doing a really important and good work. So, um, I've been talking a lot about bees and their nests, so I'm going to talk briefly about other things first before I get back a little bit to bees. Um, for things that are not bees, we should be thinking about what their offspring need. So anything that's a flower visitor is obviously getting pollen as, that adult, right? But what butterflies need even more than plants to nectar on is caterpillar host plants. We're starting to pay more attention to this now. Plants are really well detected by all sorts of interesting chemicals. Sometimes these are chemicals we like caffeine, or in some cases nicotine, or Taxol that we use to fight cancer. And so the butterflies, the caterpillars that are able to detoxify a plant, right, are the ones that are going to be able to finish their life cycle. And they usually have only evolved the ability to do that on a very limited number of host plants. So I've got three butterflies there. The Anis swallowtail uses the carrot family. And so so there's lots of things that you'd plant in a garden that are in that carrot family, including things like fennel. There's also a bunch of native species, whether that's things like lomatiums or there's various other parsnips that are native. And then Seder Kama, and they're not the only one. I think red admirals too use stinging nettle. I actually planted some of that in a pot. Um, I'm crazy. That photo on the Pyrus was taken in my garden, so I'm really trying to get them to nest with me. Mourning cloaks need willows and aspens. So thinking about host plants is an important thing. That's especially important for people who live in areas that are more where the land has been altered for human use, right? So there's probably in those cases lots of nectar sources, but fewer places to nest. If you live close to forest, the nesting sites are probably fine, and you might want to be focusing instead on nectaring. So it depends on your landscape context, and I think it varies in this group of people that's here tonight. Hummingbirds need bugs, and so I just like to remind people to be patient with any pests that you see because you want them to feed the birds. And hoverflies and wasps, they need the prey, right? So they're really amazing for pest control, but that means not spraying every aphid off of your plant, but leaving them alone because then the hoverflies will move in. Usually, if you don't do anything, you'll notice that they're declining after a week. Spraying them with water will also remove this squidgy little thing on the bottom, which is this voracious hoverfly larva. They're wonderful, wonderful little creatures. As far as other things you can do, these are memes that I've captured off the interwebs. And the one on the left is from one of my favorite organizations, the Xerces Society, which is committed to invertebrate conservation, which includes bees. But they kind of don't have it right. They say that leaves are food and shelter for butterflies and bees and stuff. And that might be true if we were living in a deciduous forest. But I will tell you that here, where we're naturally in a coniferous rainforest, Most of our butterflies and beetles and moths are not in leaf litter. They actually overwinter in different places, and bees never do. But I'm gonna go through that with you. But it's true that you should not have a tidy space. If you leave things in your garden, you're going to support more different beneficial insects. Whether that's leaves, which I do think you should leave, just not for the reasons that they're telling you, but also stems. I've talked about cavity nesters, so having those hollowed out stems is important. So bees are not overwintering in the leaves. The ground nesting bees are waterproofing their nest holes to keep the larvae dry. The bumblebees overwinter underground. This is an unfortunately too cropped photo I found online of a bee in a flower pot. So the very top of this photograph is the soil surface in this pot. So she's just down a couple inches, right? She's not in there. Now leaves can be important for insulating that soil and protecting it from freeze-thaw cycles, but she's not actually in the leaves. She's underground during the winter. Um, for stem nesters, you should be leaving pithy or hollow stems in your garden. And so I like to point out that some of these stems are way too big. All the ones that don't have a little blue arrow are way too big to be used by bees. You're free to remove those, but the other ones that have smaller openings might have bees nesting in them. That's leaving that is more important in our region than leaving the leaves. And I'm going to go through this probably kind of quickly, but just to explain that to you. Because people seem to be confused that this is a long game. This is a long, dedicated thing if you want to start doing this. So next summer you'll have a pretty flowering plant, and then by next fall you're going to have just the stems remaining. You should leave those stems over the winter. If you cut them in the fall, then they will be more likely to fill with rainwater and rot. So you should leave them intact. The following spring, you can cut them back, but please don't cut them back to the ground. So I'm here in year two. If you leave 6 to 8 inches, sometimes even more, then you'll have a piece of stem that bees might be able to nest in. And those larvae, remember I said that the larvae come out the same time next year. They don't come out till year three in the spring. So they're in those stems all through the summer, all through the following winter, and they come out in year three in the spring. So if you didn't cut things back this past fall, please don't cut them all the way back this spring. You might have bees nesting in there this summer, and then next summer they will emerge. And over time, the old stuff will break down and the new growth will hide it. I know that some people don't like the way it looks, but it's a great way to support our cavity nesting bees. So what about butterflies? I mentioned I would get back to this. So most of the species in our region, not all, but most of them are on stems or in bark crevices, either as pupae or as adults. And that's because they didn't evolve in a place with tons of deciduous leaves. Deciduous leaves aren't the best choice for them. We don't have them. Um, and so, but some are on stems, like this one in the lower left, right? And you might miss that. It's pretty cryptically colored, right? So they'll often make those pupae on their host plants. And believe me, if you had the caterpillars, you would know it. You would see all the damage. You would see their poop. I know I have polyphemus moths because I was finding their poop all over my backyard last year. You would notice it's hard to miss. So if you see that kind of damage, be careful when you're cutting things back. You don't want to put these pupae, into a brush pile, right? Um, but they're mostly not in the leaves. They're mostly, again, on stems or in bark. And our predators, I've kind of glossed over this, but I like mentioning them at least briefly. Things like wasps, which I have mentioned, ladybugs, lacewings, hoverflies. They are also in cracks and crevices. And some of them spend their time in ground covers and mulches. So I think it's really important to have lots of plants growing on the ground, if only to support our ground beetles, which they've got a very charismatic green one here, but we've got beautiful purpley iridescent ones here in our area. So they would use leaves if you left them. And you should leave them anyway, but it's not for all those other critters, it's for your soil. One of the things we know is that we used to dig over garden beds all the time. That's certainly the way my mother learned how to do it from my grandmother, right? We say that you shouldn't do that now. That disrupts the soil structure that is super important for normal processes like when nitrogen fixation is happening there and soil nutrient recycling. You should leave your soil alone and you should leave your leaves on it. And that's because that will feed all the organisms in that food web that's down in the soil. It's a bit off topic for tonight, but I don't want you to get the impression that I don't think you should leave your leaves. You 100% absolutely should leave your leaves. And if you're like me and live in suburbia, I go to my neighbors and I take the leaves that they don't want because I want all those leaves in my garden. Okay. So that was just a few things you can do as a gardener. And now I'm going to just talk briefly about what the kind of flowers that pollinators like. These are photos of flowers from my various field sites over the years. And as a pollination biologist, I can look at these photos and I can pretty much guess what the pollinator is. And that's because some flowers have adaptations that exclude certain kinds of pollinators. They limit the pollinators that can visit them to get more directed pollination. So, for example, some have very long floral tubes, so only organisms with long tongues can visit them. That could be hummingbirds, it could be long-tongued bees, but only long-tongued organisms can get the reward in those flowers that I've circled. Some need you to have a big body like lupins because you have to open the flowers. Some are buzz pollinated, which I've already mentioned is just a bumblebee thing like the shooting star. And many have landing platforms that are directing the organism that there's only one proper way to get into the flower. But all the rest, everything, all the other photos on this screen are what I call easy access flowers. They're the inclusive ones that allow anybody to forage for pollen and nectar from them. So the other ones, if we're talking about bees, are mostly just bee plants. So all those buzz pollinated things are bumblebee plants. The things with the long floral tubes are bumblebee or hummingbird plants. And those trap shaped or irregular shaped flowers are bumblebee plants as well. Because they need to be pried open. Only big things can do it. Okay. So if you want to support lots of pollinator diversity, please include plants that are not just for bumblebees, because bumblebees will go to them too. And that way you can have more diversity in your garden. So sunflowers are the classic example. Think of it's like a big plate full of food for pollinators to forage on, right? So I'm just going to give you examples of three families, which are the ones I recommend, and then the ones that in my research we get the most bee diversity on. The number one family is sunflower family. We have quite a few bees that are specialized on this family. It's not too specialized because it's a very diverse family, but they only use pollen from this family to provision their nest. I've got a mix of native and well-behaved but introduced plants on this slide. All of them are very easy access. Anybody can get food from them. And that's true of the carrot family. I've got on the right some things that are garden plants like astrantia, which is also called masterwort, cilantro, and dill, which sometimes people plant because they're attractive to things that would do biological control, like ladybugs, whose larvae will eat your aphids, right? And on the right are some of our gorgeous native species that I have found difficult to grow in a garden situation, but that have specialist bees on them out in natural areas. And then there's the rose family. So it's not just roses, of course. It's things like salmonberry, um, all the raspberries and blackberries, apples, and I've got two of our native roses here. And I like to point out to gardeners that it's those kinds of old-fashioned roses that matter, not the ones that are all petals. So the way we've bred those really, those tea roses, we've substituted petals for anthers. And so if you can't see the bee food, it's not a good flower. And if you're not sure when you're going to purchase things, just take a moment, watch. The bees will tell you what they want you to bring home. The Heath family is worth mentioning. There's some food plants in here. We've got some natives like kinnikinick, our native rhododendron, and some well-behaved, lovely garden plants. This one in the lower right is Enchanthus campanulatus, red bell Enchanthus. It doesn't have a very approachable common name, but I once watched it for about 5 minutes and I counted 26 different species visiting it in my yard. The mint family is not easy access, but it has so much nectar that these are magnets, but mostly for bumblebees. One of the things I like about the mint family, though, is it does support things usually late in the season. Um, and I will always have a special place in my heart for lavender because the photo on the upper right is our endangered western bumblebee, Bombus occidentalis, on a lavender flower. This is from a study we were doing in gardens near the Garryoke ecosystems of southern Vancouver Island. We had been looking for that bee for years. We never saw it in the Camas Meadows, and then we saw it in a garden. And so I think gardens, well, I know I've published on this. Gardens are really important reservoirs for biodiversity, and that bee is the one that I hope you all find this summer with a white bum, highly endangered. Okay. Well, what not to plant, bedding plants, all those things that people plant large amounts of these annuals. They're bred to have a long bloom. I think many of them are probably sterile or they just don't have very much pollen and nectar. But watch out for common names. So while French marigolds are not good for bees, pot marigolds are amazing. So are true geraniums, as opposed to those things we call geraniums that aren't. They're pelargoniums. And in both cases, you can see the naughty bits of the flowers. You can see the pollen. When you can see the bee food, that's the thing to be planting. Okay. The other thing that I caution people about is don't, if you're going to get cultivars, don't get the double varieties. So the ones on the bottom are bee friendly, the ones on the top are not. So those sterile viburnums and the ball hydrangeas are not good for bees the way the lace cap ones are, where again, you can see the naughty bits, you can see the pollen. So, just to sum this up, there's lots of color shapes and sizes. If there's lots of bees, and so if you have lots of color shapes and sizes of flowers, you are going to have all those different kinds of bees coming. They have different sizes, different size mouth parts. They're all going to need different kinds of things to get food. Prioritize those easy access ones because you'll support more diversity. Bigger patches are better than one of each kind of thing. That's also good garden design. And think about having things early as well as late. Uh, you know, Late is to me just not as important as early. Having something that's out when the bees come out when it's warm in March is really important. And so many of our bees are active in April and May, and I see that a lot of gardens don't have a lot of food then. So that's the time to focus on. Um, and this graphic that I made just shows why that matters because different kinds of bees are active at different times of the year. And so having food available at different times of the year is just really important. And the plants I'm showing in these photos are all native plants in the coastal western hemlock biogeoclimatic zone. If you're looking for more resources, the Xerces Society I mentioned, they have native plant lists. Pollinator Partnership is really a great resource for planting. There's other places I would send you for more information about bees, such as the Native Bee Society of BC. But if you want plant information, these two are good. And I will be launching a webpage probably in a week. It's so close that will also have some of the information that I talked about today. And this is one of the things that I have. So this is garden plants. I'll just take a moment and then I'll end. So different colors are different kinds, groups of bees, and this is a top 25 list from our garden study in Victoria. And the things that I like to point out is that the top plants are ones that are mostly bumblebee plants. You can see there's big yellow, lots of yellow, right? So they did so well because bumblebees love them. But the easy access plants that are on the bottom of the slide, the calendula, the aster, I put red stars on top of those bars. I like those bars better because you can see there's more diversity, more different kinds of bees in those different colors. There's also on the website, and this is on the existing website, native plants, because I'm imagining that that will be of special interest to this group. So the native plants that we found are especially attracted to pollinators in our research. And with that, I'm going to end with my take-home messages. Bees are most important for pollination, although other things will visit. We have many different kinds, more than you might have realized. All pollinators need places to nest, and as well as flowers and food. And the best way to support them is to plant easy access flowers like this rose flower in the photo. And with that, I'm going to stop my screen share and answer some questions.
Oh, Elizabeth, that was just so lovely. Thank you so much. Wow. Wow. I was writing down, okay, what to plant. Yeah, good. Okay, you guys, so please take this moment to ask any questions you might like. You can type them into the chat or you can raise your hand and do it, you know, with your mouth, like we used to do it. So anybody would like to ask something?
I see a hand up. Tim, would you like to unmute and ask?
Great presentation, and I don't have a specific question, but I did want to let people know who maybe don't. On the bottom of the screen is a little heart that says react. If you click that, it'll open a little screen that says raise hand.
Thanks, Tim.
And okay, Domena, I believe you have your real hand up. How cool is that?
The real hand, that's the only one I have. So at what time would you suggest I am okay to rake up the leaves under my apple trees, for instance?
Apple trees are hard for me because I know that there are reasons to have to clean up those leaves that are separate from what you would do for pollinators,
Yeah.
right? So because in case there's any like leaf diseases, you don't actually want them to stay under the apple tree. Although it turns out I was reading recently that it's okay to put them somewhere else. And so that's what I would suggest you do is that you move them elsewhere. As far as when is the right time to remove remove more or to cut back any stems in your garden. There's a lot of stuff out there that's about the temperature, but I find that that can be harder for us to understand than things like this. If you have any lawn, and you might not, I have very little now. If you need to mow your lawn, then it's warm enough for the pollinators to be out, and you could be cutting things back. But if it's not lawn mowing season yet, it's too soon. Um, and certainly by the time you're planting tomatoes, which for me is not till sometime in May, May is a good time to do some of those garden chores because by then the bees will have emerged from their nests. But apple trees are a little bit different. I think you have to be thinking about the cultivation aspects of it
Yeah.
and not leaving the leaves under them because of the potential for disease spread.
Thanks.
Owen and Doug, whoever, yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm Owen from Bowen Island. I sort of have two questions. The first one is, given what you've said about the different types of bees, is there any one that we should be favoring when we're planting? Is there anything that we can do to promote species lost or whatever? In terms of mining bees, digger bees, sweat bees, and so on.
As far as, is there a particular bee that you should be doing more for? That not in my opinion. My opinion is let's just support all of them. There's so much that we don't know about our native bees. I say just plant lots of different things. The one to keep your eye out for is that western bumblebee, the Bombus occidentalis, with the white back of it, tip of its abdomen. That's the one that's being considered for listing as endangered here. But personally, I think just support them all. The two things that you might consider adding more of to your garden, based on this project I did this past summer, anything in the aster family, because we have specialist bees that use that. I was surprised that in urban gardens I caught a number of specialist bees on that, including a, a Hyrides species and the as well as the sunflower bee, and I'm not remembering the third one. I should remember it. I spoke about that this morning. And the other thing that seems to be really good is lupin. So I would say adding asters and lupins, and in my dream I would be adding a willow, but I can't fit a willow on my lot. I've got now an introduced creeper one because we have something like, I'm going to get it wrong. Lori will correct me. I think there's something like 15 species of mining bees that collect pollen only from willow. So, that's not because they're endangered or anything. It's just because how cool is that? And the ones that are specialized are the ones that would benefit most from being supported in developed areas because that's where their food is more likely to be lacking. Dana.
Oh, but Grandpa raised his hand, so Grandpa's got to go
Oh,
first.
Thank you. That was a very, very informative. I enjoyed that. Um, I have mainly a light shade and shade garden into which I plant a few annuals. Which annuals would you suggest in my shady garden, which would be most attractive to the bees?
let me think for a moment. I mostly am a perennial gardener, and in my shady garden, the things that I'm catching bees on include hosta, turtlehead, yellow wax bells. Um, I'm I'm not so good with annual plants because I'm lazy. I want to plant something once it be done. Um, but most of the things that I know that are sold as annuals for shade are not good for bees. Begonias are not, impatiens are not. Um, that doesn't mean you can't enjoy them, right? There's other reasons to enjoy the flowers in your garden, that even if they're not good for bees. Hellebore, though, there's one. Oh, it's a perennial.
I,
I'm gonna
I
think
have a
about it,
lot
and
of
I'm gonna send
hellebore.
some stuff to Dana to send on to you because I actually am blanking on annuals that would be good. I can come up with annuals for sun a lot easier.
Thank you.
I'm writing it down.
Martha, are you raising your hand because you have an addition to that? Okay, please do.
I just wanted to ask a question, like because it came out of a comment you made in response to another question, is how soon should I mow my lawn? Like, I think obviously some people would say never, but I'm wondering is, mid-May?
Oh, wonder, Martha, have you heard of that thing called no mow May? Is that why you're asking? Like
Yes,
this?
exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Great, great. I'm happy to talk about that. So, no mow May started actually in the UK. Um, I think we should here in BC have either no mow April or no mow March. May is too late. And so the idea, so when I see lots of dandelions out there and other, things that we might not be accepting of at other times of the year is really early, like March. In this climate, we have so many other things that are blooming in May that you don't need things in your lawn to be supporting pollinators. By then, I'm just thinking of all the things that are done already, right? Um, and it's also not true that you should leave a lawn for a month. So, what research has shown is it's best to mow about every other week. And that's better than mowing weekly. If you let it get longer, then there's more chance for some flowers to be there, and that will support pollinators better than if you mow weekly. If you leave it for a month, the grass just gets really long, and usually you get just Eurasian weeds, so you don't get the things that might be beneficial to bees. As far as lawn weeds that we know are really good for pollinators, that English daisy, that little Velis perennis, is surprisingly good for
I've got
pollinators.
lots of that.
It's amazing. The clover, of course, but you need a bit of a long tongue for that. Um, I don't see much on dandelions. I'll be honest with you. We don't catch that much on it. But then there's other things that are getting into at least my lawn that are amazing, like Prunella vulgaris, which is self-heal, and I've set blue star creeper loose on my lawn. Uh, which, people think of it as this invasive, but I could show you a whole bunch of pictures of different kinds of butterflies that are using it in my lawn. So, and we mow about every other week, I would say. But there's no time where you shouldn't mow. It's just don't mow super frequently and leave it a bit long so some of those flowers can come out.
Oh, I assumed with no mow May, I wasn't supposed to mow until the end of May, and it's
I know, not
pretty
true.
long by the time the end of
No, no, not
May.
true. And then you're
Okay.
just annoying your neighbors, but you're not helping the bees. So like don't, so and so I have very little lawn, but I have little strips because I want to show that I care, that it's intentional, that all the wild, crazy parts, because I just planted a new almost all native garden last year, and it looks like people might think it looks really messy, but I'm showing that it's intentional. I have paths, right? So I think if you're going to have some lawn, it's good to take care of it so that you're not annoying your neighbors and then go crazy everywhere else. get rid of as much lawn as you can.
What
Right?
about the clover they suggest you plant instead of grass? Is it good for bees?
Yeah, it can be, but I find that it's mostly good for honeybees and bumblebees. It's not good for other kinds of bees. And so if you want to get rid of lawn because of chafer beetle, I would say that the one part of my lawn that hasn't been eaten by chafer is where I've let the blue star creeper in and the prunella in. And so a yarrow is another one. You do have to keep mowing them, right? So these bee turf substitutes still need care, which is why I tend to just turn lawn into something that doesn't need care, which to me is a perennial and shrub border, right? A mix of natives and well-behaved non-natives. It's way easier to take care of than a lawn is.
Lovely. Elizabeth, you didn't mention brassicas, and we're all pretty proud of our kale that
Ah,
goes to flower in the spring, and reluctantly get rid of it because they're swarming with bees. But is it only one
that's
kind?
great. No, so we have found that both, so we didn't know what to call them in our research, so we just call them the yellow brassicas and the white brassicas. The white ones are probably arugula, to be honest, and so I didn't talk about this, but thanks for reminding me because I let them bolt in my own garden. They're great for pollinators. All sorts of things use them. Early in spring, it's sometimes the only game in town, and so if you've had things that overwinter and then they start bolting in the spring, let them bolt. I tend to do it on a rotation. I cut things back at different times, so there's always some of that for somebody to eat. Um, I think they're really great. They're great beef food. So yeah, keep it up.
Okay, good. Tim,
Yeah, on that last point, I always let my brassicas bolt for that reason. I tripped across an apiarist magazine, 15 years ago. That had a little list of the most visited plants in BC, and I think mustard was like number 5 or something like
Yeah.
that.
If
And so
I brought back up
I've done
my
it ever since I saw that.
if I brought up my slides again, I would I'm gonna look while we're talking. I'm sure it's in there. Time bellflower aster yellow mustard is number 13 on the graph that I showed you. And that was probably my article because I published it in BC. But yeah, it's good to let all those things bolt. And I'm going to tell you another thing about bolting brassicas and also broccoli, cabbage, any of those things. If you let them bolt, it turns out that when they flower, the scent attracts the predators of cabbage white butterflies. And so it attracts things like the wasps and stuff that are going to parasitize your cabbage whites. And so letting there be a little bit of bolting in all of your cruciferous vegetable crops is not only food for bees, but it's going to bring in the predators that are going to help control any pests that you have.
I have to tell you that the name of our marching band in Lasqueti is the Bolting Brassicas.
Ah, you never told me that. That's awesome. I'm looking in the chat and there's a lot of discussion of ceanothus. It's amazing. It is quite the pollinator magnet. I'm curious what these little dark bees are. So somebody's going to be sending me a picture of these little dark bees sometime. I'm sure there's a great diversity. Like I normally see a dozen things in any 5 minutes I'm looking at ceanothus. Different bees at different times of day, absolutely, because they have different temperature tolerances. So that's why if you're interested in bee watching, you should do it at different times of day and on different plants. Where else? What else did I see? Yeah, more saying yay to the bolting brassicas. They are really good. They're good for not just pollinators, but for predators too.
That's just a really important point that when we are helping the community record these to say different times of day, because we were all thinking get out early in the morning, be done with it. But yeah, thank
Yeah.
you. Anybody else have any questions? Today you saw drone flies on your crocus. Oh boy. Well, I got really mosquito bitten today, you guys. What the heck? Yeah. Anybody else? Ken?
Tim's raised his hand.
Oh, was Tim? You have your hand raised, please.
Yeah, just at different times of the day thing, because I remember being curious, like there's all these different types of bees and how do they compete for food. I didn't know about the temperature tolerance, but I did notice that at different times of day, I saw different types of bees, especially like on that ceanothus, which is, I mean, from dark till dark, somebody's on it.
Yes.
And I started noticing, yeah, there's one different in the afternoon than in the evening and different in the morning. There's somebody's always on it, but they take turns apparently.
It's great. So bumblebees can shiver to warm up, so they're out early and in the morning, and other kinds are going to need it needed to be warmer to be out. The last ones to come out, in my experience, are the really tiny bees, those little 2, 3 millimeter ones. They don't come out till it's nice and warm, so sometimes I don't see those till the afternoon. And we have a couple more questions. So Farron, do you want to unmute? Or Barb, one of you.
Hi, I was just wondering, do you need to supply any water for the bees?
Do you
Would
need
that
to
help?
supply what for the bees?
Water.
Oh, no. So that's for honeybees. So all those cute, and people are giving them to me, these cute little like bee sipper things. Bees get the moisture that they need from the nectar in their diet. Occasionally, if it's really, really hot and dry, which doesn't happen so much here, you would they would sometimes get a little bit of moisture off, off the edge of a flower or a leaf in the morning, a little bit of dew. But the ones that need water are honeybees. They actually bring that moisture back to the hive and then like kind of spit it out and suck it back in to make an air conditioner in the hive to cool it down. So most bees do not need water at all. They don't drink.
Okay, Farron's up next, I think.
No, it's me actually. It's Hillary. Hi.
Oh, hi, Hillary.
Hi. You mentioned Oregon grape and red flowering currant, and I'm just wondering about other early flowering things. If any, I'm curious to see what you rattle off to see if there's anything that I might not have thought of.
I mean, those are the ones that I think of when I think of native plants that are early blooming. Because they're, and one of the hard things about native plants is which are the ones that you can actually get. So those are two great early flowering ones. For other early flowering things, like really early, there's other kinds of Mahonia. So I actually have Mahonia ex media. So it's a charity. It's a cultivar, but it's been blooming since November. It is still blooming. The hummingbirds love me right now because I have flowers. And the heather is great. There's a number of flowering bulbs that are great. If you're in the if you have dry enough soil that you can plant something like camas, but that's usually May, right? So the earlier things are the tougher ones. And so I will admit that I often go for non well-behaved non-natives because we don't have that many commercially available native species for that really early. Later, it gets easier. Snowberry is amazing. Thimbleberry is amazing. Um, Snowberry especially is a great, but it will spread. It will take over, is the problem. But for early, I would say the top two are those, not surprisingly, not June plum. Like, that's the first thing to bloom, but I've never seen anything on it. So I can't recommend it.
I think we go Domena and then Julia.
Okay, some years ago I had mites on my orchard bees, and I'm just wondering whether they are species specific or would they potentially affect or infect any of the wild bees or other bees as well, or even honeybees as well.
That's a good question. I actually don't know the answer. They're not the same mite that attacks honeybees, but I don't know if you would find that same mite on a different species of wild bee. I have seen mites on other things. I very rarely, like on a mining bee, but usually mites are an issue in those bee houses. That's why you need to clean them. So, if a mason bee was nesting in a hollow twig in the wild, that hollow twig would only last, say, 2 seasons before it would rot away. But a mason bee condo lasts for many, many years. A bee expert I know, actually, what he does is he drills holes in pieces of wood, and then after the second year that they're used, he covers them loosely with saran wrap, makes a few holes so the bees can get out, but nobody can get in, and then he puts it on his wood pile. so that you don't have the parasites building up. So if you're seeing mites, that means that there's probably more you can do to clean out your bee condo, because um, only time I see those mites in high numbers are bees that are nesting in those condos as opposed to nesting somewhere else.
Yeah. Thanks.
Julia.
Hi, Elizabeth. Thank you for the wonderful talk. I was just wondering, you had said that the male bees rest in the flowers. I was also wondering if the female bees do as well, and where they rest. Thank you.
So, you will sometimes see bees just kind of sitting on a flower and not doing anything. And when I see that, it's usually because a cloud has come over and it suddenly feels 2 or 3 degrees cooler, or it starts drizzling. They wouldn't normally rest on flowers. They would go back to the nest. So the females are going to be in the nest. They spend the night times in the nest. So once they dig it, in the nest that they hatch out of initially, and then once they dig one, they'll spend the evenings in there. Um, but the male bees aren't welcome because they're not helping, right? So they're the ones that don't have anywhere else to go. And that's why you wind up seeing them on flowers. Or sometimes just they'll grab onto a grass stem with their jaws and just sleep that way. So but yeah, the females will be in the nest.
I know everybody saw in the chat that Sue says that Dave Colson says a hellebore is really good for early bloomers. And I know you have hellebore in
Yes.
your garden, Grandpa. So there you
It's
go.
out now. Crocuses can be good. And the bees don't care. They'll visit things that they can't pollinate. So I mostly have pictures of honeybees doing this, but right now the native hazelnut is blooming. I'm not horribly allergic to it. And the bees don't care that that's a wind pollinated thing, right? They can get food from it and they'll go to it. They're very eclectic in their taste. So, um, yeah, and again, I'm trying to come up with native species for you. So obviously, hellebore is not. There's the introduced arbutus, not spready though, not invasive. That blooms now. I see bees on that. Yeah, that's super early, right?
Elizabeth, when in their cycle should you be cleaning out the bee houses for mason bees?
You would normally do that in the fall. So they're going to be out in like April, May doing their thing. And by September, October, usually those larvae have developed far enough along to be into a pupae. So you might not, I didn't point it out, you might have noticed that they spin a little cocoon. They're in these little round jelly bean things. And so that's the time where you can clean it out. You can actually check. People candle them, like they hold them up against a light, and you can check to see if there's any parasites in there. So that's normally done in the fall, and then you need to keep them cool until it's time for them to hatch out in the spring. Some people put them in their fridge, but you would need an old fridge. You can't have a new fridge because the new fridges, they would dehydrate them. So you need one that doesn't dry out. But I think even better than that is an unheated shed or garage somewhere cold outside. Or they'll hatch out too soon. Yeah. I've had people say that they never got to it. Like, it's better to clean them a bit now than to not clean them because it's just tragic. When they hatch out and they're just covered with mites and other parasites. Yeah.
So I think we've used up the questions that people want to ask, and on behalf of the Lesquiti Island Nature Conservancy and the rest of all the Lesquitians and other folks who joined us this evening, I'd like to thank you very much for an absolutely wonderful talk. You managed to get across a lot of wonderful gee whiz natural history, as well as really good ideas that we can take home with us and start putting into practice in our gardens tomorrow. Thank you very much, and remember that you have a standing invitation to come visit us on Lesquiti.
Stay tuned.
Thank you. I will. I'm going to do that. Thanks, everyone. Thank you so
So
much for coming.
everybody who's joined in, stay tuned for next stages in the Lesquiti Coyote Bee Project. There will be some workshops on the island on how to use iNaturalist and how to take pictures of bees. And and we'll let you know more about that soon. Good night, everybody.